It appears that the US government is about to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicle imports. The tariffs are currently at 25%, but the goal is to raise it to be much, much higher to protect the US car makers and the unions. What will be China's response? How will this affect Tesla? So I've got Jeff Lutz joining us. Jeff is an ex-supply chain chief executive officer at multiple Fortune 100 companies. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, Robert.
So this is not yet announced, but there has been other kinds of events that has happened, so we know where we're at today. So this is kind of the news. U.S. is about to impose tariffs on Chinese EVs, so we're expecting this, I think maybe Tuesday. We're recording this on a Monday. And then you said there are already tariffs on any EVs made in China. The article here from Financial Times said that U.S. is set to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports. The move marks the latest effort by Biden administration to protect the domestic industry from the cheap competition. You got photos of BYD that's now setting up shop in Brazil and South America. Now they have publicly said they're not intending to enter the U.S. market, and certainly not during the election year. But we know that they're going to do this at some point. So you said this, there are already roughly 27.5% tariffs on EVs made in China put in on 2018-19. Revisiting the size makes sense. I would go to 70% or higher. What was your thinking there?
Yeah. So tariffs are, they're used for a couple of reasons, but you're really trying to close the gap on an external threat, kind of or competitive advantage that another country may have, and you're basically trying to protect your labor force. And for years, by the way, the U.S. wasn't doing a lot on the tariff side at all. But it's from doing business in multiple countries, I can tell you that we were literally one of the only countries where you can basically build something somewhere and ship it into the U.S. and there'd be very, very small taxes, if any, to do it here. But when you look at a country like India, or you look at a country like Brazil, you know, they would have anywhere from 30 to 100% in some cases. Argentina used to as well. And basically what they would do with those tariffs, say, look, this is, if you want to build this abroad and you want to import it in, these are the tariffs. But if you want to set up manufacturing inside of the U.S. and employ U.S. laborers, well, then these tariffs aren't, applicable, and you could set up manufacturing here and distribute product. Now, this is where it becomes a problem, though, for some of these companies, like, for example, Chinese EV. If they're not a fully automated process, their cost structure, in many respects, goes out of whack, because this is where they're getting the advantage, in China, for example, in terms of labor. And so if they're not efficient from an automation perspective, if they're not efficient on the labor side, they can get away with that in China and produce very low cost vehicles, or in other countries. But if you were to take that same factory, cut and paste it in the U.S., their costs would be exorbitant using the U.S. labor rates, and then the economics don't work. So in terms of EVs, there's EVs that are being made that are, $10,000, even less. But there's a couple of EVs now that are they're retailing in Latin America for $20,000. And, I think this is what, I'm sure the lobbies from, Ford, GM, it basically went to the government saying, look, you've got to head this off. Otherwise, it's not only going to cause a problem for us at the General Assembly level with all the dozens of factories all over the U.S., but it's also going to cause huge issues for our supply base. So if you think about auto in the U.S., I think some of the estimates are almost 3 million people in the U.S. are employed doing some sort of job that contributes to the U.S. auto industry. So this would be cataclysmic if you're able to basically import at a fraction of the cost. Now, the other side of this is, well, how do you think of it from a competitive advantage perspective? Like, consumers would have access to lower cost vehicles, and it would actually help. It would help on inflation, it would help on a number of things. But I think the devil's in the detail. I don't want to, by the way, I'm not one here to write off the performance or the quality or the capability of a Chinese EV. But it would have to pass certain safety standards, certain reliability standards that are required in the U.S., and that's where some of the costs may come on. So kind of what you see abroad may not be 100% of, what would be applicable here in the U.S. In the end, tariffs are put on to bridge the gap and close the gap, to kind of an external competitive advantage.
Okay.
Or disadvantage, I should say.
Right. No, that's obviously protectionism is happening in every single country. But let's have that discussion a little bit later here, where China is opening it up for Tesla. In the meantime, these events are happening. TikTok, this one. So we'll see. Let's continue the news here. So the Biden administration plans to raise tariffs on the Chinese electric vehicle imports from 25% to 100%. That's a lot more than what you were suggesting, 70%, as it intensifies efforts ahead of the U.S. election to protect American industry. Administration expected to announce the move and other tariffs on clean energy imports this Tuesday, according to people familiar with the situation. So for 3 years, they've been reviewing the tariffs that Donald Trump put on imports. Part of the trade war he launched. The new EVs will be announced alongside the conclusion of the review led by the U.S. Trade Representative. So, it's not a government thing, right? It's like two parties both agreed that there should be tariffs. The 100% probably is the right move, right, Jeff? But you were thinking 70%.
No, I said 70% or more. So
Okay.
I'd be fine with 100. I think it makes sense. Remember, if you have a vehicle that they're producing for $10,000 or $12,000 and it would be willing to import that, if you only put a 25% tariff on that, if it's a $12,000 vehicle, you're talking about adding $3,000 to it. It would still be an amazing value here. So that's why they've got to go to probably do 100% or more. And ultimately, we have to figure out what the strategy is, because we have to figure out in terms of where do we have a competitive advantage, where we don't have an advantage. And to me it looks like a lot of legacy auto is just honestly really stuck. You've got ICE vehicles which hit peak volume in 2018 and have never in the US have never grown above that. So you're talking 6 years ago when you had your last peak. And when you're operating that far below your peak, we're at 15 million total units, and a larger portion of that now in the US is EV. It's over 1 million units. So you're significantly you're down. I think we're up at 21 million units in 2018. So you're operating at a third less than your peak. So that's a huge cost. Those costs were built out. That capacity was built out, and so you've already got a huge disadvantage there, and from a utilization perspective. So ultimately, we have to figure out where are we going from a U.S. auto perspective. By the way, I don't think a lot of people are aware. When you see a Ford or GM in the U.S., about 1 in 3 of those are produced outside of the U.S., mostly in Mexico. I don't think people are aware of that, and they're and as part of NAFTA, they're coming back over the border. So I ultimately think we need to figure out what our strategy is, how we're going to have a competitive advantage, because basically, if you look at U.S. automakers, they're really not doing well abroad. I mean, they're basically getting shut down in China, and they're not doing well abroad. But if you compare this to Tesla's thriving in China. Remember, this is different than, people think, the U.S. putting tariffs on what's China going to do back. Well, then China may raise tariffs in another area too. Remember, China put tariffs on U.S. auto in advance of 2018. They were already on. That's what people think, like there was a trade war starting in 2018. The other countries already had the protectionism in place. They made it difficult for the U.S. to do business and import business in. So the U.S. had to go and set up manufacturing. So all of these auto companies set up manufacturing in China. They employed local Chinese labor. They followed all the laws. They all did joint ventures, which they're sharing IP, they're sharing information, they're sharing revenues with those companies, except Tesla. But Tesla is a good corporate citizen in China. There's greater than 95% local sourcing. So it's not like they set up a factory in China, but they're bringing everything in from Vietnam or Indonesia or so forth. They're locally sourcing, so they're really driving up labor labor content and employing people in China. So they're a good corporate citizen.
Yeah. So wanted to ask you what's going to happen to Tesla, right? Because Tesla in China, they just got approval, or about to get formal approval, but it looks like that they had agreed to let Tesla be test out full self-driving, and even conversations now about robotaxi in China, because Tesla was able to accomplish four of the major regulations that they had to maintain China's national security and their risk and so forth. Here in the U.S., though, we've got Biden in February also ordered an investigation into whether China connected vehicles, a growing category of vehicles connected to the internet that includes EVs, pose a national security risk to the US. So they're concerned about the Chinese cars coming into the US because they are connected, of course, just like with video cameras, just like Tesla is in China. So what will happen if the US counters like this to Tesla? What's the risk?
They all have to worry about information security, and if there's anything with cameras that's mapping terrain, that's mapping roads, so they have the same thing about DJI and drones globally as well. And what all of these companies need to do is they need to basically declare what they're doing with their data, where it goes, and basically keep it in the perimeters of that country. And then it's usually pretty manageable. Remember, China wants access to Tesla. When Chinese personnel come into Tesla and work for a number of years and come out, they usually go to other companies. There's learnings, and they want access to the best. They have a history of doing this, and they will make sure that that their priorities are met, but they're also pretty accommodating. And I think they're going to continue to be accommodating to Tesla. Now, obviously, that could change if Tesla changes their attitudes or behavior. But, Elon, I think he complies by the local laws and regulations of countries. And this is where people get confused. They get confused about free speech. They get confused about tariffs and other things. And as long as you go into a country and say, look, okay, what are the rules of the road? What should I be doing? And if it's fair, set up business and do business. If it's not fair, get the hell out. That's how the world works. So I believe that's what Tesla is doing in China. That's what other companies are doing when they do business in China. If you have a problem with the local laws or how people are treated or so forth, then get out. Otherwise, you have to comply with the local laws and operate under what their requirements are. And then you have access to 1.5 billion people that want to buy your products and services. So that's the way it works. In terms of retaliation, if the U.S. increases their tariffs, which they most likely will, China will, in return, increase their tariffs most likely, probably in the same industry or probably, elsewhere. So I could see, a return or retaliation. I'm not a big fan with how this is being managed. Before, the tariffs were used in concert with making a larger trade deal with the country because there's a significant trade deficit between the U.S. and China. It didn't really improve dramatically over the last, call it, 5 to 8 years. And the tariffs were used as a way to kind of start, changing and leveling the playing field. And the other reason to use tariffs is when you have a massive competitive disadvantage and you don't want your local industries and your local labor force being crushed. And I believe that's the case with EVs. By the way, if people didn't want EVs, the U.S. would not be imposing these tariffs on China. So we'll see. This is all reported as something that may happen. It hasn't happened yet. But it shows that there's a demand for these products, and it shows that there's disruption. And I think the challenge on U.S. automakers, including Tesla, is to get product to consumers that has equivalent or better capability at equivalent pricing. That, to me, is the challenge. We shouldn't just block out the competition and then continue to produce vehicles at very high prices and wonder what's going on. with our inflation and so forth. So in short, I think they are going to retaliate. The question is what and how much. For Tesla, they build in turn. Remember, they locally source and they build and distribute locally. So this is an issue. Could they change Tesla's tax structure in China? Maybe, but that goes back to they want Tesla in China. They want Tesla's business in China. They want their knowledge, their capability. And even though there isn't a joint venture, anything formal, they employ thousands of people, and thousands of people get hired, fired, move on, and so forth. And they want that center of excellence and that capability. Same reason why India is trying to pull Tesla in as well.
Yeah. So this, just to clarify, this is import taxes into the U.S. So if the Chinese companies decide to, and they're allowed to create a manufacturing facility in the U.S., maybe have to partner with an American automaker. That's what Tesla's done in China. They're built a factory there, so it's not importing into China. So even if they retaliate. To clarify also, we're recording this video on a Monday. Tomorrow's Tuesday, which is the date that they might announce this. And so hopefully this isn't too late, but it's good to understand the whole process of tariffs at this point. And so, Jeff, with just perception wise, it sure looks like, just perception wise, just positioning wise, it looks like that China is positioned as a tech forward company, really courting Tesla, allowing them to implement all the greatest new technologies, sharing that with the other manufacturers in China, going as far as we're going to go robotaxi first. Here's the U.S. treating Tesla like crap, just not even, fighting them instead of supporting them. And this is an American company. It's just perception-wise, it looks like that America is just not being forward in terms of tech forward and just saying, hey, we are the leaders. We are we're going to export this technology. Anyways, it's just perception wise. We'll see what happens. I get the whole tariff war, the trade war. I get that. That's important. Tariffs and all that, imports, protection, all that. So I'm not against this. So just to complete this bit here, you got the tariffs are the latest action by the administration to show how Biden is continuing to impose costs on China at the same time that Beijing and Washington pursue efforts to stabilize relationships. They just had their summit. And this is the part that's interesting. They just had their summit. They just agreed to cooperate on climate-related issues, including the rollout of green energy. And then they come around and then they impose these taxes. I hope that during that discussion, they'd already said, yes, we're going to tariff on the Chinese EVs. I mean, that's kind of obvious that they were going to do it anyway. So I don't think that this was a big deal. But it's just, again, weird that they had that cooperation.
Yeah, I don't know if they... I mean, that was a strange meeting, and and I think right after the meeting, like a reporter baited, the president with a question, our U.S. president with a question, is she a dictator? And he goes, yes, he's a dictator. So the whole thing didn't really go super well. And like I said, for the last number of years, you can call it the last 10, 15 years, all these countries have been operating with a protectionist mentality, and the U.S. was basically saying, hey, send whatever you want in, basically with very, very little taxation and tariffs. So I think it's time and it's appropriate. But I think your other point, Herbert, was spot on, which is, I was making this earlier too, the U.S. really needs to respond with technology, with a solution. Like you go back to what Tesla's doing with Unboxed. Unboxed is being piloted in Austin, Texas, and if you can figure out the cost structure, they're trying to figure out how to reduce the process time, the total process time to make a vehicle, to reduce its total cost structure. And there's some data and videos right now, because right now China has this reputation of being a highly manual process for vehicle production, but they've started taking on castings, and there's videos, of this Xiaomi manufacturing process, which is supposedly fully automated. So they're going to come up pretty quickly on this, because China knows that, you've got access to a big market in their own country, but to really compete abroad in Western Europe and the U.S., your manual assembly process won't export. It won't work economically in those other countries. Your cost structure will be more in line with the U.S., and then you've got this perception of a Chinese brand versus a U.S. brand. Why wouldn't I just go buy the U.S. brand? So they're going to have to figure out how to get this automation right. And if they do, they will be able to export. And there's still going to be higher cost than in China per se, but it will definitely be more in line. And they'll have the ability to compete. So the key for them to compete abroad is to more highly automate their processes and get that cost structure and get the total process time lower. So I think that's important. But yeah, this is, I think China's going to respond to this, and we'll have to see where that goes. But again, from a Tesla perspective, it's they're already set up locally for manufacturing in China. They're set up locally for manufacturing here as well. And this is what's happening now. We had 2 decades of supply chain globalization, which was build it in one place and then distribute or set up supply chains in multiple places, but really honestly set up to distribute around the globe. And now what you're seeing is the regionalization of supply chains. So setting up like a South America supply chain, setting up a North America supply chain, setting up a China supply chain, setting up a rest of Asia, a Western Europe supply chain. And that's where I see most of supply chain going over the next decade, is this localization piece. The globalization piece is definitely being pushed to the side, because again, a lot of people saw what happened during COVID with access to certain things that were only made in one country per se, and it became a big problem of both security, both from just having access as well as just economic security as well. So this whole trend is going to continue, I believe, over the next decade.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think we'll find out the news shortly, but I think we'll see. But Tesla seems to be okay. It might actually be more harmful to the domestic U.S. automakers. Many of them are trying to partner in China so that they can create the cars in China and sell it to China. So they're pulling back anyways. But you know what I mean? Like if China retaliates and imports, it's actually the domestic automakers and the European automakers are going to be affected the most, because they're the ones importing the cars, although they're trying to change that soon. Thank you, Jeff. We'll find out more. Appreciate your feedback. Follow Jeff on X, the Jeff Lutz. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
I've created a website that is the most comprehensive resource for the Tesla investor. Please check it out. Simply go to my website at herbertong.com.